Okay, so that this session is now being recorded. Okay, I just want to let everybody know that for this morning. I just ask that please, for both presenters and attendees, just keep those mics muted when people are talking, and for the presentation and throughout that presentation spot, there is a mute button there on those microphones. Make sure that mute button is clicked for today. Okay, what have we got next? We have a couple of things here on just how we expect that you will use those chat windows and also how you're going to pose those questions for today. So I know you have a lot of questions today. We want to answer those, but we also don't want to disrupt our panel too much as they're talking. So what we do ask that you do is that you please locate the question and answer function that is at the bottom of your screen or at the top of your Zoom screen. You'll be able to use that function to ask all your questions, those fantastic questions as you have them, and our MC will be able to direct those to the panelists at an appropriate time. We also have the chat function there. I hope that you have a look for that chat function. We're going to be using that chat function to communicate with you, sending you useful links that you can click on and resources. So we'll be putting that to you. Please don't put your questions in that chat box. We do ask that you use the question and answer so that we can manage the questions through there. So sometimes if you can't see your chat window or the questions and answers, it might be under that ... under that more. Really excited for today. If you have any technical questions, you can send me a comment through the chat window and I will see about assisting you as best I can. Now, we are going to kick off today's session. I'm going to hand this over to the fabulous MC, Heather, and she is going to unmute herself and address you all this morning.
Thanks, Chris, very much. That was, what an intro. That was fantastic. And welcome everybody to the Gambling Aware Fairfield Forum. I know we're all really looking forward to a very full day and a very informative day. So thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Heather Nesbitt and I'm going to be your host for today's forum. Even though this is a virtual forum, it's a bit unusual this year because of COVID. It's great that we can still do this. We felt it was really important that we got together, even if it's not face-to-face, to do this virtually, because it's a really important topic that we're talking about today. And we really want for everyone to continue to learn and to raise awareness about gambling harm, as it's a really important issue for all our communities. We're very privileged to have a lot of high quality speakers with us today. Thank you so much, everybody that's speaking at the forum today. We've got researchers, peak organisations, and people with lived experience. We have representatives from many diverse communities that live, work and enjoy Fairfield City, our beautiful city. We're all here to learn and to share our knowledge on this really important topic. Today we have 3 sessions. This is session 1 and it's a public webinar that really focuses on gambling harm and understanding the impact and finding services. The session will finish at 12 o'clock, so we're here for the morning. Our second session will start at 12:45, and then again, it's a public webinar, and that's going to focus really on some of the current research and projects that are happening across Fairfield and Western Sydney. And many of these are being undertaken by the sector. So some really interesting presentations for session 2. I really encourage you to hang in there for session 2. And we're going to have a lunch break between session 1 and 2, about 45 minutes. So you will have time to have a bit of a break, get some lunch, have a wander around and refresh. Session 3 is at 3 o'clock this afternoon, good timing. And that's a closed meeting for invitees only. We'll be talking through some of the things that have come out of today's forum and seeing how, as a group of stakeholders, we can really work together to reduce gambling harm. So it's a very full day and one that I'm sure you'll gain a lot from and we're really going to enjoy. We have specific time, as Chris has talked about, for questions and answers, Q&A. please put those in the Q&A box, and at the end of a number of presentations, I'll go through those and we'll try and answer as many questions as possible. It may not be possible to do all of them, and I encourage you, please ask a question to a particular presenter, because we want to focus in on their hard work and the presentations that they're giving today. Finally, we know that the session's being recorded and you'll be able to access that recording later on. We'll send you links to these different sessions so that you can go back in and look at some of the information that people have talked about today, and to share that with your networks, which will be really important. So for all of us today, there's no better example of the importance of learning and sharing knowledge than that set by our First Nations people. I'd like to ask Uncle Darren Duncan to join us now from the Ganangara Land Council to present a welcome to country. Thank you, Uncle Darren.
Good morning and welcome to all participants in this morning's online gambling awareness forum, hosted by Fairfield City Council. On behalf of Ganangara Local Aboriginal Land Council, we acknowledge the families within the Cabigal clan of the Darug Nation as the traditional custodians of the land we span, which include the Fairfield area. On this day, as we come together to raise awareness about the issues of gambling harm in our communities, we pay our respects to elders past and present and emerging, and to all the first people within our community today. On behalf of Melissa Williams, our CEO, I welcome you. Thank you. Hello?
Thanks, Darren, very much. Thank you for that very kind welcome. And it's disappointing.
Not a problem.
That's great. And I know Uncle Tony and Uncle Barry wanted to be here,
yes,
but we're unable to do that. So thank you for stepping in for us.
That's not a problem, anytime.
Thanks very much, Darren. So now I'd like to introduce Peter Hope and Catherine Warner that are going to talk about Gambling Aware Week. And some of the background to that week. We all understand that it is Gambling Aware Week, a very important week in our calendar, and Catherine and Peter are going to talk about that now. Catherine.
Welcome to
Sorry, we've just lost Catherine there. We might get Peter to talk, and Catherine will talk in a moment.
Okay, so I'll just get us started on this. We just wanted to raise awareness this week, advise everyone that this Gamble Aware Forum is a Gamble Aware Week initiative. Now, Gamble Aware Week was previously known as Responsible Gambling Week, and this is the second year that Fairfield City Council has hosted a local event on Gamble Aware Week. If you are interested in finding out more about Gamble Aware Week and what actually it involves, please feel free to check out the Gamble Aware Week website, which is located through the Office of Responsible Gambling. It's an initiative of the office, and there's a whole bunch of resources and information on the website where you can actually go, including a campaign regarding checking in with your mates, which they commenced last year. There's also online games and different activities that you can do with different groups in an educational capacity. We'd like to also acknowledge that this event is actually sponsored by the Office of Responsible Gambling as part of our Community of Practice project that Fairfield City Council has been funded for. And just to raise awareness generally that the Gamble Aware Week is an opportunity to bring attention to gambling harm and in the community, and yeah, feel free to check out the website. We'll pop the links to the website in the chat box in a moment's time, so you can find out more information directly from the website.
Thanks, Peter, very much for that. We're going to put some of those links up in the chat box. That's coming, and we'll have that happening very soon. So we've got some great presentations this morning, and our first one is Kate DaCosta from the Alliance of Gambling Reform. So it's great to have Kate here. Kate has worked for the Alliance for Gambling Reform as a New South Wales campaigner since 2017, when the Alliance first began actively working on reforms to reduce gambling harm in New South Wales. Kate's worked with a range of different organisations and individuals across Western Sydney and more recently on the Northern Beaches. And I know she's been getting some press about that, so that's terrific. Kate is going to set the scene for us today by providing an overview of gambling harm in Fairfield. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks, Heather. And I need to share my screen. So let's see. Let's hope this works. I'm speaking to you from Darkinjung and Guringai country on the Central Coast. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of that land. As Heather said, I've been working since 2017 in New South Wales for the Alliance for Gambling Reform, which is a national advocacy organisation which seeks change that will prevent and minimise gambling harm across Australia. And in particular, my focus in New South Wales is on poker machines and the harm that they cause to individuals and particularly to the community. And the first conversation I had in my role as a New South Wales campaigner was in Fairfield with Morlai, who was working at CORE at the time. And in fact, we discussed, wouldn't it be great if we could get a screening tool to check for gambling harm? So it's really pleasing to see the advances that have happened in Fairfield in particular in that time. Okay, let's see. So the reason we talk about gambling altogether is the enormous expenditure in Australia compared with other expenditures like alcohol, illegal drugs, tobacco. And all of these substances are subject to public health campaigns in all jurisdictions. Gambling is the only one that does not. Even though it's known that Australians per adult are the biggest losers in gambling. So that's per head, it's probably a bit over $1,000 per head by now. These figures are a little bit out of date. And what is different about Australia's gambling makeup, other than most other countries, is that at least half of that is lost on electronic gambling machines, EGMs, which in Australia are almost all poker machines. They mimic the old-fashioned one-armed bandits that use symbols related to playing poker. There are other electronic gambling machines, but we don't have to worry about them there. But the other reason we talk about poker machines in New South Wales is that of the world's non-casino poker machines. So casino is a destination where people go for the intention of gambling. Pubs and clubs have other social functions, but in New South Wales in particular, many of them also host poker machines. And of those non-casino poker machines, 75% of the world's machines are in Australia and half of them are in New South Wales. And most people don't realise that none of them are in Western Australia, where there are no poker machines in pubs or clubs. They are a legal product and they are completely normalised, especially in New South Wales, partly because of where they all are. There are so many, they're on most street corners in the cities, and they are in fact designed to addict. Some of their most dangerous and addictive characteristics could be removed or regulated by legislation, and in other jurisdictions they are, but not in New South Wales. It's relatively easy to regulate poker machines because they're large physical objects, and that is strikingly different to the problems that we have from harm caused by online gambling. And despite the rise of online sports gambling as the fastest growing gambling product in Australia, our biggest losses by a considerable margin are still through poker machines. So people play poker machines or gamble on poker machines and can have fun. They can have a small bit of excitement and walk away and no harm has been incurred. But it is important to remember that a poker machine is actually a device designed to take money off people and to keep them gambling for as long as possible and to get them to return as soon as they can. In New South Wales, the return to player amount is a minimum of 85%. People think this means they have an 85% chance of winning, but it's not true. It means that over the life of the machine, it is only legally obliged to return 85% of the money gambled. So for every $10 that's gambled, only $8.50 comes back over the life of the machine. So the house always wins. And the way the machine operates in order to encourage people to keep using it and to keep using it for longer is based on psychological understandings of behaviour first examined in the 1950s using pigeons and rats. And it's because the reward that you get from a poker machine, which initially is a win of actual money, but increasingly if people gamble often on poker machines, the reward starts to be the dopamine that is released in your brain when you win and when the sounds and lights and animations on a machine are activated with a win. And that starts to release substances in the body, and those are the substances that are released that relate to reward and pleasure. And so the body becomes accustomed to those and for some people, starts to seek out more and more of those experiences. And the way that it works most effectively, if you want to keep people sitting at a machine, is to do as these pigeons are doing, which is to peck on a lever to get a pellet of food. That's their reward, the equivalent of getting a payout on a poker machine. If the pigeon learns that every 5th time it pecks on the lever, it will get a reward, it will get a piece of food, then generally speaking, they wander around their box and do their pigeon stuff. And then they come back and they peck the lever 5 times and they get a pellet of food. So they know that when they're hungry, they know how to get food exactly. But when the mechanism is set so it's a random reward or a variable ratio reward, that means the pigeon can never figure out how many times it has to peck the lever in order to get a pellet of food. Might be 1 time, might be 20, might be 2, it doesn't know. So instead of wandering around the box doing pigeon stuff, they just stand there by the lever, pecking away, and they get a pellet, but then they keep pecking because they don't know, it might be 50 pecks until the next one comes. And that's what we observe when people gamble on poker machines, is that because the reward is a variable ratio, then they keep playing because they never know the next button push might be the one that wins. And there are other techniques in the design of poker machines which encourage this persistent behaviour. And they do that by presenting what is in effect a reward, the sound and light and animation that goes off, which would normally be associated with an actual win, also triggered by features called near misses and losses disguised as wins. These are banned in some jurisdictions, but not in New South Wales, where the machine, as you can see here, it's close to a win, and the machine plays those sounds and puts up a sign and says, oh, you nearly won. It was a near miss. Since all of this is an algorithm, which has very little to do with how hard or quickly you press the button, a near miss is, a near win is, or a near miss is nothing of the kind. It's just a kind of marketing technique. But observation and studies around the world have shown that people whose brain is responding to these near misses, the activity in their brain is related to those areas that process reinforcement and reward. So in effect, they get the same chemical reaction in their brain as if they had actually won. And losses disguised as wins has a similar effect in that you put in, say, $10 and the machine says, and then you press the button, the lights and the sound goes off, and the machine says, congratulations, you just won $2. But actually, you just lost $8. but it's presenting a loss as if it was a win, again, to trigger those reward mechanisms and reinforce that, that association of light and sound and animation towards what your body is producing. So research in Victoria, exit studies of people who use poker machines show that of 10 people at the pokies, 3 of them have no problem. It's like they can gamble and have a fun time and walk away. But 7 out of 10 are experiencing some type of harm. It might be low levels like difficulty sleeping or raised anxiety, but 2 of them are experiencing quite significant harms. And I know other speakers today will go into more detail about what those harms are and the reasons and their implications. So I'll just present this to show that although out of the total population of adults, half of whom don't gamble at all, and most of whom don't use poker machines, it's true that the levels of harm are relatively low if you take the entire adult population. If you take the population of people who gamble on poker machines, then the rate of harm is very high. And in fact, of the total harm experienced by people who gamble, 85% of that harm is experienced by people who would be characterised as low or moderate risk gamblers. And of all the people who gamble, 5 to 10 other people in average are affected by their behaviour. So the number of people who are harmed is quite extensive, more extensive than other problems which are treated as a public health matter. So just as a comparison for us in Fairfield, every day in Fairfield, $1.4 million is lost through poker machines. It's slightly more in the council area of Canterbury Bankstown, which is now amalgamated, so it's a much bigger area. Down in Liverpool, it's just under $500,000. That's every single day of the year. That amount of money is lost on poker machines. This does not turn over figures. And that's money not being spent in the local economy, in the broader local economy. If we can compare that with the whole state of Tasmania, there are fewer poker machines in all of Tasmania than in Fairfield, and the daily losses are significantly less in Tasmania compared with just the Fairfield LGA. So here's a map that shows all the venues in most of Sydney that have poker machines, H for hotel, C for club. The lighter the colour, the lower the number of machines. So there's a lot of hotels in Sydney and the inner west with only a few machines. But as you can see, there aren't many in Fairfield that are this light colour. The same with the clubs. There are a couple of very small community clubs that don't have poker machines. But this is the number of venues in Sydney that have no poker machines. So you can see how ubiquitous, how widespread they are through all of our communities. And just quickly to finish off, an update on what we know, and Sally has done, who's speaking later this morning, has just released the results of their first wave of their study of behaviour during COVID. This is a graph from the study undertaken by the Australian Gambling Research Centre. And I think although the results of the 2 studies differ in some cases, one of the key findings is that young men have increased their expenditure during the COVID lockdown in particular, where young men have nearly doubled their expenditure. That's during the lockdown, of course, that was entirely on online gambling, whereas most other demographic groups have reduced their spending on gambling during the shutdown. And we can see that reflected in online spending. This is from the Ilion Alpha Beta tracking of data in the average week. So if an average week of spending on online gambling is 100, that's an artificial number. This is the date when all venues shut down across Australia, and this is the date, more or less, when poker machines restarted in New South Wales. But as you can see, from the time of the physical land-based gambling shutdown, online spending has been well above average sometimes 2.5 times as much as average every week. And it's still above average, although Victoria is now the only state where poker machines are still shut. And even with the restart in New South Wales, those levels are still higher than average. What also happened once the restart occurred was that some of the bigger clubs, and this is Club Marconi, entered into a bit of a land grab, and they applied to expand the footprint of the gambling areas in their clubs so that they could, instead of turning off every second machine to ensure social distancing, they wanted to have every machine turned on, so they needed double the space. So Marconi erected this room. In fact, this room was erected before they had official permission to do so, and took over most of their lobby. And as you can see, if this is the entranceway, if you're coming into the cafe or the non-gambling areas of the club, these machines are highly visible and the sound is very noticeable, so that for those people who are triggered by poker machine sound and light, as they walk in the door, they're bombarded by those triggering noises. And in the first week back after poker machines restarted in New South Wales, the daily losses were actually higher than in the same week the previous year. So that in clubs in that first week, and these are the industry figures, the daily losses were $8 million a day compared with $7.8 million in the same week in June last year. And the same in hotels, $4.6 million. So this is across the state. So this is with far fewer machines turned on and fewer people going out. The losses were actually higher every day, which shows us that that the lockdown in New South Wales was probably too short for people to reset their behaviours and seek help. And those daily losses have remained higher as far as we can tell. The data in New South Wales is difficult to get hold of. But it seems to be at least as high or higher, and that is possibly in some ways as a response to the stresses of the pandemic situation, anxiety possibly from losing a job or uncertainty because of corona. But it's certainly not showing that that the industry as a whole and really all the structures that we have in our state are doing anything to minimise gambling harm. If daily losses are a very bad proxy for harm, we don't have other measurements exactly from New South Wales, but if we as a community are continuing to lose this kind of money every day, then we seriously have a big problem. Part of that is related to the level of shame and stigma that events like this are doing a lot to remove. There's a public narrative that constantly talks about people with gambling issues as if there's somebody else and not the people in the same room as us, or even us. And that's why having people with lived experience, as we'll hear from today, is so good. And the victim blaming language like problem gambler and responsible gambling is embedded in official literature and in laws. So, and the other problem is that gambling harm and the existence of addiction are not well recognised, and so the policy responses are not set up to deal with that yet. So what we just ask as the Alliance is that people change the language they use or we use. We're working to move from an informed choice model to a public health model for dealing with gambling. We want to remove the social licence of gambling. I'll be quite frank about that. And we want this to be an issue at council, state and federal levels until we achieve reform to minimise and prevent harm occurring in the first place. So if you belong to an organisation, we just urge you to educate your own community, be a moral leader in your community, stand up against and speak out about some of these practices and work with other organisations. I'll just skip through because I know I'm over time. I just wanted to remind everyone that treating public health matters is a long game. It takes a very long time, as this graph about reducing the road toll in Victoria shows us, that it takes lots of different actions to reduce the road toll, and it takes decades to achieve that reduction. But it is possible. Instead of 1,000 people losing their lives on the roads in Victoria, less than 300 are losing their lives every year now. So it is effective and it saves lives. So what we want is more like this and less like this. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate. That was really insightful. Some great data there, and particularly the change that's happened with COVID. I think people will probably find that quite interesting, the rise of online gambling, which is an interesting trend. And certainly your conclusion about the things that we need to do. And that will be an important part for us to take away to discuss later on. If people have questions for Kate, could you just put them in the chat box, but we won't get to them now because we'll go on with our speakers. But certainly there may be some questions for you, Kate, so hang in there, okay? I'll be pleased if you stay with us. Our next speaker is Mary Lou Gitsy. Sorry, Mary Lou. Mary Lou is the manager of Multicultural Problem Gambling Service for New South Wales. As you can see by her bio here, in addition to her many academic qualifications, Mary Lou also has extensive experience working with a wide range of communities and stakeholders and organisations, coordinating and delivering services. Her presentation today is about the signs and the symptoms of gambling at harmful levels. So welcome, Mary Lou.
Thank you and good morning. And I apologise if I scared you with this picture. It scared me a little bit that came up with my bio. Let me just get to sharing my screen. From beginning. I hope you're seeing it all well.
Can't see it there, Mary Lou. Can I just get you to just try that share once more for us?
Oh, okay. So hang on. Are we good?
No, I still can't see that there. Can you just try once more for us? Can you see the share screen option there, Mary Lou? Just
yes, that's how I've been through just swooped in. Yeah.
Yeah, as we tested yesterday.
Yeah.
Just hit run on the presentation. There we go, Mary Lou. It's sharing now.
Okay.
It's shared your whole screen now.
Yep. Okay. I'm
if
coming.
You want to just.
Yeah, I had to get out of it. Sorry. I was worried that I won't be a moment. Apologies. Here we go. Are we?
Perfect.
Thank you, Chris. Sorry, everybody. 21st century sometimes gets the better of me. I'm dialing in from Parramatta, from the land of the Parramatta people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Kate has talked to you a bit about people, why do people gamble? And majority of us do for entertainment, excitement, thinking that they can win some money and escape, obviously. We all done it, and well, majority, sorry, of New South Wales residents have done it, as statistics show, and got away with not much money, or hopefully not a lot of distress. But the rest of the people who are gambling to excess, why would they do this? And Kate again talked to you a lot about the psychological aspect of how the gaming machines in particular are established, and how they worked out so that ultimately the clubs will get away with the money and the punters really won't see much of it. But also that your brain gets trained to believe that once you won, you can do this again, and that's pretty attractive. But also other reasons are sometimes people go there to escape from anxiety, sadness, and other problems. Some of the people that we speak to who have gambled to excess say when they're in front of the machine, they forget about everything. They forget about their troubles, their problems, their arguments, their lack of finances. They get in the zone, they say. Also feeling lonely, some of us people who are coming from collectivist cultures will testify to the fact that we're not very used to being on our own. And living in 21st century Sydney, the place is fairly widespread and people are living in small family units far away from each other, so checking in with each other is not as easy as it was in the past. And also it becomes a habit. What shall we do? Go up to the club and put a few dollars on the pokies, and sometimes that's okay, but for unfortunately some people that will become a big problem. Who would do this? I'm putting this up because there are some ideas out there that certain communities gamble too much. Men gamble, women gamble, older people gamble. Well, we all do gamble. Men, women, various socioeconomic background, from any educational level, from people who have not finished high school to people who have master's degrees and doctorates, from any age, from sadly under 18s, we know gamble, which is against the law in Australia, but it does happen to parents, grandparents, people who get picked up from home by the club bus because they can't drive anymore or choose not to drive anymore, and they go to the club and gamble. And from any ethnicity and culture, we just do it differently. Some of us like the pub, the club, the electric gaming machine. Some people go to TAB, sports betting, etc. So how will you know that gambling is a problem, even in yourself? Sometimes it's one of those things that just creeps up on you, or yourself, or one of your family members, your partner, your parents, your child. There are some signs and symptoms that you might look at and go, oh, okay, that something might be happening here. So moodiness and irritability, withdrawal from the family, that often happens because gamblers who get into excessive amounts of gambling do get preoccupied with it. They get preoccupied with when to get there, how they're going to get there, how they're going to get the money, and try to find ways of finding that money, try to find ways of escaping from the family or from workplace or their studies to get there. So become quite moody and irritable, especially when they come back and they have lost. Secrecy, unexplained absence as well. Again, if in the family it becomes a point of discussion that someone is away for too long, gambles too much, persons who are embroiled in excessive amounts of gambling will make up all kinds of excuses of where you've been, what they've been doing. The financial difficulties, money can go missing from the house, bills are piling up, your friend or relative keeps borrowing for various reasons. And more recently during COVID, when the government had made available superannuation, we do know that quite a number of people access their superannuation early and then they put it down various gambling avenues, whether it was online gambling or later on when the clubs reopened on the pokies. What else? Repeatedly borrowing, yes, so illegally obtaining money. Sadly, there's again the possibility of people taking valuables from the home. So you find things might be disappearing. At times, sadly, also some of our gamblers have embezzled from their workplace, which then becomes a legal matter. So these are things that if are happening around you as a community member or to one of your clients as one of the service providers, might be a good idea to ask the question. When things get out of hand, we are looking for help, but counselling, which is in Western society is quite acceptable concept is not as easy to access for communities from culturally linguistically diverse communities. So I speak about this a little bit just to try to alleviate perhaps some of the misconceptions. Counselling is confidential, and confidentiality in the Australian context is a very important and very different concept from many other places. As a counsellor, if I disclose information about yourself or your situation to anyone without your consent, I can lose my job. So it is quite a serious issue. Please don't think that if you come to us, we will discuss this within the community. It's a time to listen and someone to talk to. Now, again, coming from collectivist cultures, we used to going to family, to community leaders, to religious leaders to talk about difficulties, but sometimes that's just not possible. Once again, turning to a stranger, to a counsellor is not necessarily a comfortable and easy thing to do, but please understand that this is a situation where we are there to talk to you about the problems you might be facing. And in our services case, we do speak up to 35 languages at the moment. So you might find that you can talk to someone in your first language. Non-judgmental. So we are not here to tell you what you've done wrong, why things are not going well, to keep you, to hold you responsible. We are here to help you resolve your problems. Again, responsive to individual needs, meaning that we are trying to find a person that you find it most comfortable to talk to, and being able to make some referrals. Counselling is really useful to help you understand, to make sense of what is happening. You know, most people think, well, handing over money for nothing in return, who would do that? It's not as easy as that. There's a lot of reasons why people get into levels of gambling that will really strip them from everything they've got. So to understand, make sense of what it is that's happening in your life can help in a great way towards recovery. And also, counselling can help you work out what changes you can make and how you can make that. So please take the opportunity to engage with a counsellor if you feel that you need some help in that environment. Barriers to counselling, a lot of people say, oh, I can deal with it myself. Of course, and you know, in reality for most people, dealing with gambling problems can be very, very difficult without assistance. So think about it, if you had a rotten tooth, you wouldn't try to extract it yourself, right? I mean, physically you could, but it would be better to get some help from the outside, from a professional. And really nothing takes more courage than actually reaching out for help. So that's just rephrasing the idea of I can deal with it myself, being the strong person. I don't see how just talking about gambling would help. Well, as I said before, it is one of those things that is not just talking. Counsellors are trained to help you unearth what is behind all this, what is happening in your life, why would you be going back there for more and more whilst your family relationships are deteriorating, why your finances are dwindling. So it is not just talking. We have skills that can help you manage and help you address the problems. And if it's not yourself, it's one of your family members, you need to think about what are the questions you could ask them to talk about the advantages of coming to gambling counselling, what you might get out of it, and what's the advantage of not going there? That's a question that perhaps instigates some conversation and helps people look at their situation. So we are here to help. The Multicultural Problem Gambling Service for New South Wales. Our 1-800 number is manned from Monday to Friday, and if it is after hours, we'll respond to your contact as soon as possible. We offer free and confidential counselling, and I explained a bit about confidentiality, not just to people who are gambling at problem levels, but also families, particularly from non-English speaking background. We can also facilitate referral to financial counselling if it's related to issues stemming from problem levels of gambling. So, and also, for legal support where legal issues have risen as a result of problem gambling, whether that's to do with protecting your finances, whether it's protecting yourself because there's domestic violence involved, whether it's to do with embezzlement or jail time. There are legal professionals that we can refer you to. It is all free to the client, and referrals can be made by yourself, for your family with their consent, or if you're if you are a service provider, the referral can be made with the client's consent directly to us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mary Lou, very much. There's some great, really practical information there that you've provided people with. So thank you so much. Some really good and some great links there.
That's my pleasure.
For us. Thanks, Mary Lou.
Thank you.
Now, we're very fortunate today and privileged to have a very special guest speaker with us today. Steve Cannane is a Wakely Award-winning journalist on news and current affairs on the ABC Investigative Unit. In addition to his many roles at the ABC, his most recent work has unearthed the complexity of problem gambling across Australian communities. Steve's going to be presenting to us today some very compelling findings in relation to gambling and harm, and in particular about self-exclusion and why it isn't working. Please welcome Steve.
Thanks very much, Heather, and thanks for inviting me along to speak. I should just explain really what I've been doing over the last 12 months. I work at the ABC's Investigations Unit, and we decided to do a project on the gambling industry in Australia, basically because of the figures that Kate DaCosta just showed us half an hour ago, that we lose $24 billion a year in Australia through gambling, more per capita than any other country, and the country who's second isn't even close to us. So I thought it was worth looking at for that reason. But also I'd had a bit of experience reporting back in between 2010 when the first Productivity Commission report into gambling came out. Oh, sorry, that was the second one. And that then led to a big argy-bargy in federal politics when Andrew Wilkie had the balance of power in the Gillard government and in the House of Reps, and he was pushing for poker machine reforms based on what the Productivity Commission report suggested, which included $1 maximum bets on pokies and also a form of mandatory pre-commitment. And that led to a massive political fight. The clubs movement, driven out of New South Wales, was targeting marginal Labor seats. Labor backbenchers got panicked. Millions of dollars was going into this lobbying campaign. So I had that in the back of my mind about the power of the lobby groups in Australia. And when I talk about the power of the lobby groups, mostly talking about Clubs New South Wales and the Australian Hotels Association. But I was also a correspondent in Europe between 2016 and 2018 based in London. And I remember doing a story on that maximum £2 bets on their version of poker machines went through, brought in by the Conservative government, the health minister there at the time. Interesting that it was treated as a health issue. And it was highly uncontroversial. It just went through. One of the lobby groups complained a little bit, but they didn't really have much power over there. So it just showed to me the real difference between the power of the lobby groups there and the power of the lobby groups here. So as part of this gambling project, we asked the ABC audience to tell us what's going on inside the industry, inside their families, tell us what we should know about the gambling industry. And so we did what we call a crowdsource project, where we asked people to get in contact with us. And so what we did was I did an initial story on sports betting. We asked people to contact us and tell us more about the gambling industry. And so far, over 2,000 people have contacted us. And it's great because some of those people have worked in the industry. Some of those people have suffered gambling-related harm, either individually or through their families. And they're able to tell us how the industry works. So it's a great, great resource. And you can see trends, so I can categorize this database that I now have. And so, for example, I was contacted by over 100 people who said self-exclusion doesn't work. And so I was then able to go, okay, well, that's an interesting theme. All these people are saying that they're applying to be self-excluded. They're going on the register, but they're still being allowed to gamble. And I'll come to that in a moment, but it's good to have this kind of audience out there telling us what we should look into, and you can kind of pick up on these themes. So I might just quickly talk about sports betting, because that's the first story that I got into. And as Kate mentioned, it's not the biggest form of gambling in Australia at the moment, but it's the fastest growing, and particularly amongst young men. And we're seeing grow to a large part through technology and the fact that people have these betting apps on their phones. And I really knew nothing about sports betting until I started speaking to a guy called James Poppleton, and he was a former employee of Bet365. People will be familiar with them as one of the biggest sports betting agencies in the world. We often see their ads during sport with Anthony LaPaglia, the Hollywood actor, advertising them. And also you see them around the boundary during the cricket games because they're a major sponsor of Cricket Australia. Anyway, James Poppleton basically blew the whistle on their business practices. And the way he described it, he says that they stopped people winning and they exploited people who were losing. And as part of this story, I was in the UK and I spoke to a guy called Brian Chappell from a group called Justice for Punters. And he actually explained to me how Bet365 worked from his perspective. And he said they pioneered this model, which he referred to as the ban or bankrupt model. So they ban or restrict people who are successful gamblers, even if they're only moderately successful. And they bankrupt people who are losers. So it comes to the point where basically their customer base is 100% losers. And I spoke to a guy who was a professional poker player for this story, who as a side hobby was into sports betting. And he says he gets infuriated when he hears these gamble responsibly taglines at the end of the sports betting ads. Because he says that he does gamble responsibly. He studies the form, he weighs up the odds, he really works at it, and then he gets punished because he actually wins and he can't put money on. So anyway, the way Brian Chappell explained it to me, when Bet365, who is run by a woman called Denise Coates, who's a bit of a mathematical and entrepreneurial genius, she came up with these algorithms where you could restrict people who are good and keep the other people gambling still. But what the other betting agencies then found out was that they were losing all their losing gamblers to Bet365. Bet365 was attracting them with free bonus bets and reduced odds, knowing that these people were going to lose. But the only customers they were hanging on to were the ones who were winning. So then all the other betting agencies followed this Bet365 model, the ban or bankrupt model. So James Poppleton was able to help me expose Bet365 in a way that has not been done anywhere else in the world. No real whistleblower has ever spoken out about how that betting company operates. And so it's a great tribute to him that he was able to tell us about that. I then went on and moved on and did another story on the sports betting industry about a guy called Gavin Fineff, who was a financial planner and ended up losing $8 million through sports betting agencies, three betting agencies in particular, Tabcorp, Ladbrokes, and the other one was BetEasy. He was only on $140,000 a year, but he was able to lose, for example, $1.5 million in 6 months through the sports betting agencies. And they weren't checking his proof of income. Now, under their AUSTRAC obligations, these betting agencies are meant to know their customer. They're meant to know their capacity to pay and whether they may be committing fraud when they're gambling. Could they be funding their habit through stealing money off other people? So these betting agencies weren't doing their job properly. He lost $4 million with Tabcorp, and it was only then they asked for proof of income. He panicked. He then didn't respond and they froze his account. So he thinks, okay, that's it, I'm not gambling anymore. But then suddenly he gets phone calls from Ladbrokes and also BetEasy from what they call VIP managers, who VIPs in sports betting terms are really people who lose lots of money, and they treat them as if they're special. You know, they take them to the football or to the races, offer them free bonus bets, which are illegal in New South Wales. So I don't know how they continue to get away with that. And so anyway, he was targeted by these other agencies, and it's almost as if his phone number and his contact details were traded in some way by people outside of Tabcorp, possibly someone inside Tabcorp passed that number on, and suddenly he was losing more money. He lost another $4 million with both Ladbrokes and BetEasy. BetEasy gave him $3 million in free bonus bets to keep him gambling. So from my experience of looking in just to those two stories, it was extraordinary to see the practices that the betting agencies employ to both restrict people who are successful at gambling and to exploit people who are not successful at gambling. One other issue I should mention then is it seems like the betting agencies are somehow able to keep proceeds of crime in Australia, and I don't understand why that is. So somebody could commit a fraud and gamble that money away, but the betting agency gets to keep it. I notice I'm running out of time a bit, but I'll just kind of briefly talk about self-exclusion. And I mentioned that before, that, you know, over 100 people contacted us about that. And one of those people was a guy we call Doug, who's a Army veteran. And he explained to me that he'd self-excluded from 200 gaming rooms in Sydney. And out of those 200, he'd only ever been stopped in 2. And so, excuse me. So we discussed it and we came to an agreement, and he said that he was at a position in his recovery process from gambling addiction that he was comfortable to do this. So we went into 3 gaming rooms, one the Burwood Hotel, which I think is the 13th highest pub in New South Wales for gaming revenue, the Avondale Hotel in Burwood, and also the Regent Hotel in Kingsford. And we went into each gaming venue, into each gambling room, and he put $10 in a poker machine in each venue, played in each venue for 20 minutes, had lots of interactions with the staff about machines, buying drinks. We had to go through the QR code COVID register as well. And at no point in any of these venues, even though he'd specifically asked to be self-excluded from them, was he ever asked to leave? Was he ever asked a question about whether he was on the register? So he showed to me that practically it didn't work. Now, in New South Wales, the Minister responsible for gambling, Victor Dominello, has proposed bringing in fines for venues like that who allow self-excluded gamblers in, fines of up to $27,500. They don't have those fines in New South Wales at the moment at all, but they do in every other jurisdiction. Now, I don't count WA in this because they don't have pubs, poker machines in pubs and clubs. They've only got them in the casino. But all these other jurisdictions have the capacity to fine venues. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to find out how often they fine venues for breaching self-exclusion, given all these people around the country in every state and territory have contacted me to say the self-exclusion system is not working, and either they or their loved ones are still getting into venues when they're self-excluded. So I contacted each Department of Justice or regulator in each state and territory, and we could only come up with one example. And now bear in mind, these laws were first introduced 15 to 20 years ago in various states and territories. There's only one example of a fine ever being issued for a breach of a self-excluded gambler entering a gaming room. And it happened in the Gympie Courthouse in regional Queensland in 2012. And a staff member was fined $440, not the venue. So no pub or club has ever been fined at all for breaching self-exclusion. And I know that people have taken complaints to the regulators about being allowed to gamble. So it's not as if no one's alerting them. So I see that it's just kicked in to 1 minute past 11. So I'll wrap it there, but I'll just say that if there's anyone ever wants to contact me and suggest areas that we should be looking into, just click onto one of my recent stories that I've done, and you can see how to contact us through there. And please let me know, because I think it's an important issue that needs to be looked into, because there's very little transparency in this country about how the gambling industry operates. And there's a lot of, I mean, one thing you could say about the minister is he's put this bill out to public discussion, At the moment, this draft legislation, which I think he wants to introduce to the Parliament sometime next year, which is a good thing because it means individuals and community members can actually talk, because most of the time up until now, our policy around gambling has been discussed behind closed doors with lobby groups and politicians. So at least the minister currently there at the time wants to hear from the community about what they think, and it's up to the community to decide what they want when it comes to gambling policy, whether they want us to be the world's largest losers when it comes to gambling, if they're comfortable with that, or whether they want it to be a different scenario. So yeah, if you want to get in touch with me, feel free to go to the website and there's details there that you can get in touch.
Thanks, Steve, very much. That's just, yeah, some great work that you're doing there, and thanks to the ABC and your journalists for doing this work. It's really important, and I think you've shed a light on really what's happening a lot in a very practical way of what's happening out there and how important this issue is and the harm that it does occur for people, for individuals. So that's great. We've put up a heap of different contacts to Steve in the chat box, so you can go to those and get links to his story, and if you want to contact him, I really encourage you to do that, because we need to find out more about what's happening in this space. It's a really important area. So thanks, Steve, very much, and Steve's going to hang around hopefully for some questions later on. But we have our next speaker is Associate Professor Sally Gainsborough. So thanks, Sally. Sally is Director of the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, Australia's only university-affiliated gambling treatment clinic. With a background in clinical psychology, Sally focuses on the prevention of gambling problems and the impact of emerging technologies on gambling. If you have a quick look at that bio that's flashing up on your screen, it's hardly surprising that in 2019, Sally was awarded New South Wales Tall Poppy of the Year. She's done a lot of work in this space, and today she's going to talk to us about 2020, what a year it's been, and the impact of COVID-19 on gambling. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks very much. And I'll just pull up my presentation. So hopefully everyone can see that now. There we go. So thank you very much for the invitation. Today I'm going to talk in the time allocated about internet gambling overall in Australia, how it's changed over the past few years, and of course look at what's happened most recently in 2020 with the COVID shutdown. So as mentioned, I am Director of the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, and I also lead the research here in gambling, as well as looking at technology addiction more broadly, which includes how internet technology and technology such as updating gaming machines is impacting people who do experience problems related to behavioural addictions. So what I want to cover today is looking at how online gambling is impacting gambling problems overall, and specifically how online gambling is changing during COVID. First of all, if we look historically, the national prevalence of gambling has actually decreased. If we compare the 1999 Productivity Commission National Survey with the national survey that was conducted with a team that I was involved in, that there was a substantial drop. So that second tier should see 2014. We saw gambling participation overall has reduced with a reduction from 82 to 64%. And internet gambling, which was barely measured in the 1999 Productivity Commission, jumped just in the first 10 years. It was really available from less than 1% to 8%. And obviously that's increased since this time. Internet gambling is not really new anymore. It's been really well established since around 2008, when there was a legislative case that allowed online wagering companies that were regulated in one state to accept customers from other states, which really opened up online gambling in Australia. However, if we look within New South Wales, the prevalence of internet gambling participation is still quite low. Now, there are two main forms of online gambling if we think about it. One is the regulated form, which includes wagering and lottery betting, which are the two types which are legally allowed by licensed operators. The most recent New South Wales prevalence study found that only around 5% of the population sampled which isn't, despite best efforts, always representative. There are people who are just less likely to complete a prevalence survey, and those do include some of the people more likely to engage in online gambling, but still the prevalence was around 5%. If we look at the offshore gambling sites, which are those illegal sites offering things like casino, slots, poker, bingo, it was less than 1%. However, when you get to numbers this small, it's very difficult to measure. We're talking about sort of 30 people in a much larger sample. So it is tricky, but we know that it's not, totally out of control at this stage. However, internet gambling is very important despite its relatively low base, particularly in comparison to pokies, which we've been talking a lot about today, because it does have potentially problematic characteristics. It's a very immersive environment when you're online. I'm sure that most people have had the experience of starting off somewhere and then maybe much later than expected ending up on a totally different website. It's very immersive, and it's also convenient and accessible, which means when then someone has an urge to gamble, they can immediately pull out their phone or tablet or log online to start to gamble. You don't have that delay of having to jump in your car and access a gambling venue. There's potentially no age verification. Obviously, the domestic sites do make a lot of efforts to verify age. However, offshore gambling sites may have very few requirements for age verification, meaning that people underage can access gambling sites. And when it is online in the home, there's a lot of exposure potentially to young people who might be viewing someone else's gambling, watching over their shoulder, watching them bet while they're watching televised sports. And some families may even allow or permit those younger people to be involved in that wagering. So it really does bring gambling into the home environment. However, conversely, it's also very easy to hide. It's quite easy for someone to be on a website without others knowing what's going on. There's few disruptions. There's no commotion in the venue or no one to tap you on the shoulder. And there is research to suggest that when you're paying with electronic payments, you might have less awareness of how much money you're spending. Those digits on a screen can have less psychological salience, which means people aren't really thinking about the consequences of the money that they're spending. And that includes regambling winnings as well. There's a high choice. You can bet on anything you want at any time of day, and the possibility for both low bets as well as high bets, which means there's a low entry barrier. Anyone can really start gambling online, and you can spend a lot of money in a very short amount of time. And of course, advertising, which is a whole topic in and of itself, but we're all aware of the extensive advertising related to legal online gambling sites, and illegal gambling sites can also advertise in many ways, particularly through websites and apps and gaming platforms as well. So what do we know about internet gambling? We know that it is associated with gambling problems, but it's not necessarily causal of those problems. I'll just briefly unpack that, because the rates of problem gambling are higher amongst people who do engage with internet gambling compared to venue-based gambling. And internet gambling is increasingly seen in treatment settings. It still is a relatively low proportion, but it's rapidly increasing in terms of presentation. However, problem gambling prevalence is quite stable despite the increase in online gambling in terms of prevalence. The prevalence of problem gambling hasn't changed in the population. And when we look at internet gambling, in and of itself, using statistical techniques, it doesn't predict the experience of gambling problems. Instead, what we know is that problem gambling, as not surprising to most of you, is predicted by overall gambling involvement, such that when we take into account someone's entire gambling behavior, their venue-based gambling, as well as their online gambling, their frequency, their expenditure, their intensity of betting, that's what's associated with problematic gambling behavior, as opposed to just gambling online in and of itself. And this has been replicated in Australia as well as internationally across many jurisdictions. Nonetheless, there are important predictors to be mindful of when we're looking at internet problem gambling. People who are younger are more likely to gamble online, and there is a concern we might have a bit of an iceberg effect where we're seeing a few people who are younger presenting for treatment, and there may be many more who come through later on. Internet gamblers are more likely to be male at this point, particularly in Australia. If we look at other jurisdictions, for example, the UK, where there's a lot more casino and bingo and other styles of gambling permitted online, they have a greater gender diversity. However, in Australia, it's mostly wagering, and that's a mostly male pursuit. There is some suggestions that internet gambling problems might be greater amongst people with a culturally diverse background. and those with higher psychological distress. Now, the importance of this for prevention and treatment are really important because a lot of the work that was done on treatment and developing the conceptual models was done in the 1990s and the early 2000s before internet gambling was really well studied and understood. And that means we might have to revise some of those conceptual models. Sorry, I'm just going to make sure there's nothing else bothering you guys. Sorry if there's an error with that screen share. Hopefully that's fixed that now. So we need to update the training that we have for clinicians as well to make sure that everyone who is seen.
Sorry, Sally, I'm just going to stop you there. Just get you to close your emails. Somehow it's showing the presentation and your emails, and I just want to make sure that that remains confidential.
Sure, just 1 second. I think.
Sorry, everybody. Do you want to just?
Is that fixed now?
Can you just stop the screen share for a moment? We'll just try a brand new screen share and just make sure we can get this technical problem fixed. Sorry, everybody. Let's just fix this so we can pay attention to the important message that you're telling us. Just try a new screen share for me.
Yeah, just sorry about that.
No, not at all.
It's like my Zoom's trying to update during the call, which is always helpful. Is that coming through now?
Much better. Can you? Perfect, Sally. It looks like, yeah, that's fine. That'll be fine.
Apologize for that. Sorry for the technical help difficulties there. So yeah, so we do need to look at how internet gambling is affecting people who are coming for treatment and to make sure that the clinical tools and also the prevention measures that we have in place are updated to account for these new technological changes and also the new generations that are coming through. In relation to that, the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment Clinic is currently conducting a randomised control trial funded by the New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling, where we're comparing online versus face-to-face and hybrid treatment models to really make sure we can understand what's the best style of treatment available. In the remaining time, I'm going to briefly provide an overview of the research that we've conducted on the impact of COVID-19 on gambling. Now, this was a non-representative population we sampled of a survey conducted in May with 764 Australians. The full report is available online, so you'll be able to access all of these details. We did find, in contrast to many media reports, that the majority of people in our survey had reduced their spending during the shutdown. As well as the time that they were spending gambling. So that did suggest that again, picking up on the fact that most people are gambling on pokies and sports wagering, these were no longer available, that this was resulted in people reducing their gambling rather than necessarily switching to another form. Most participants, spent less or about the same amount of time gambling online, and only 1% of respondents gambled online for the first time, although our sample was more likely to be online gambling in the first place. However, we did find that people who were at moderate risk of gambling problems were most likely to increase their frequency of gambling, which obviously is important to be mindful of, that we did have this 11% of people who gambled more during the shutdown, and moderate risk gambling was associated with this. However, on the really good news of what we found, and this was represented in our qualitative responses as well, that most people who had gambling problems, so 23% of our participants reported gambling problems based on the Problem Gambling Severity Index, 60% reported that their gambling problems had decreased during the shutdown. And this is really consistent with the types of responses people were providing in their additional comments, saying that this was such a relief. They hadn't planned, obviously, the venues to be shut down, but it had provided an opportunity to step away, to realise how much money they were spending on the pokies, and that they really hoped that there was a lot of anxiety and hope that they could continue to reduce their gambling and that they wouldn't start to re-establish those patterns when the venues reopened. So we did ask people what they expected to happen, and most people expected that their gambling would decrease a lot. And this is important not so much for people's ability to forecast their gambling, which we know is less likely to be accurate, but it does suggest that when this shut down, it was a very positive experience for a lot of people, and it really was a bit of an awakening. And that's kind of interesting from a policy point of view, when you do force someone to stop their gambling or be shut out from a venue, that although I'm sure some people might have, and some people did switch to online gambling, so that's important to be mindful of, but this forced awakening really did have an impact on a lot of people, allowing them to really reflect and think about how appropriate their gambling was and what they wanted to happen going forward. Unfortunately, we did find that younger participants were the most likely to report increasing their gambling spend, again, likely related to that interest and ability to gamble online. But our key finding was that the reduction in land-based gambling as well as sports wagering didn't shift all players to online. So it's not a matter of people just shifting to other forms. Overall, most participants did reduce their gambling, but it's important to be mindful of the impact that has. So we did a second survey in August, and there'll be a final survey to be distributed in November. So as I said, they're all available online. I'm going to briefly hand over to my colleague at the University of Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, Michael Zhang, to briefly discuss the services that we do offer.
Thanks, Sally. So we've got a couple of offices that are close to the Fairfield area. We have an office in Parramatta as well as one in Lidcombe. We also have one in Campbelltown. What we do, I'm a psychologist at the clinic, and along with my colleagues, we offer a free face-to-face, online and phone gambling counselling. It's something that's done in a very confidentially. We offer a specific and a very specialized form of cognitive therapy that's been developed at the clinic for gambling, and it's something that we've seen has provided us a lot of great outcomes for our clients that we worked with over the years. And as part of the trial, the clinical trial that Sally mentioned, we're wanting to use that program and further establish its evidence base as well. We also offer, in addition to individual counseling for those who experience problems with gambling, as we know, for everyone who has a problem with, every person who experiences a problem with gambling, they may affect up to 6 other people. So we also offer within their circles, a supportive counseling service for partners and family members of those who are experiencing problems. In terms of the interventions that we provide, in addition to our specialized treatment program, we also provide self-exclusion from clubs and hotels for the multi-venue self-exclusion program, as well as self-exclusion from the TAB and casinos for their respective programs as well. In addition, we also run community groups that are, across a variety of different communities in Western and Southwestern Sydney, using what's called a DBT, dialectical behavior therapy approach, where we help folks in the community who are experiencing difficulties with gambling or other addictive types of problem behaviors, emotion dysregulation, those types of issues. We offer them this skills group program to develop the different skills that would help them to overcome those particular issues. And it's something that we've done across different communities, including populations from correctional centres, as well as from the Aboriginal community as well. Then we also have an Aboriginal outreach program that is currently, as part of that program, we operate a group at the Shed in Emerton, and also work with Tharawal in southwestern Sydney. And we have a peer support work pilot program that's been funded as well by the Office of Responsible Gambling as part of a local prevention grant program in order to develop networks of peer support with the Aboriginal community, so that we can kind of go to them and see them as the folks that are the experts in their communities, and then help them to do the work that we're trying to do with them even better. And in order to make an appointment with us, you just have to, you just refer yourself. If you're working with any clients, you can just have the clients refer themselves by calling our intake number, 1-800-482-482.
Thanks, Michael.
No referral is necessary from a GP or anybody like that. So I hope that helps everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael, very much. That's really useful. And again, we will put that information. And Sally, thank you for your presentation. We'll certainly put those up in the chat box for people to have that information, and it'll be recorded on this session recording, so people will have that information. So some really practical stuff there from Michael and Sally, and some great research, Sally. So thank you. Really interesting to see what's coming out of 2020 and what some of the experiences have been. So now we've got some time for questions. I'd love to get some questions to our presenters, to Sally, to Steve, to Kate and to Mary Lou. People have questions for them. That would be really great. And if you could put those up in the chat box, in the Q&A box, that would be really terrific. I think just some of the key takeaways from this first session, it's been interesting having a real cross-section of information there for us today. Certainly, Kate raised this issue about, addiction and what it is, and the proliferation of gambling venues across Greater Sydney, the amount of money spent, but also about it being a public health issue, which again came, a few of the other speakers were talking about that too. Steve Cannane referred to it being a public health issue in the UK, and obviously some of our other, Sally and Michael, talking about from a health perspective. So that was interesting. We also had some really practical services and discussion about counselling and the services available. So Mary Lou was terrific on that, of, some of the barriers people might find around counselling, some of the symptoms you need to look at if you have family or partners or friends that you might think have a gambling, they're spending too much, or they're gambling too much. Some really good practical things that we can look at. And certainly in our chat box, we've got a lot of links to a whole heap of services, to our speakers today, and reports that you can access to have that information and get a greater understanding of really what's happening. So that's great. I think we're just going to check if we've got some questions there. Just one at this stage. We've just got one question at this stage to Kate DeCosta. So Kate, are you still with us? Great. Thanks, Kate.
Yep.
So really the question is, you talked about, I'm just reading it now, you welcome the adoption of the gambling screen tools. And can you provide some examples of the tools and what's been adopted in New South Wales or the Southwest Sydney context? I know we have a speaker in our second session that's going to be talking a little bit about screening tools, but you might want to talk about that.
Yes, exactly that project is going to be presented in the next session by Nick McGee. It was a project developed through the Fairfield Health Alliance, which is in the council and the local health district and the primary health network, which works with GPs. So that was, as far as we know, the first tool that included community workers. There's been some work on screening through GPs before, but we don't think a project's been developed that trains community workers to also talk to their clients about and looking out to detect information about gambling harm. So hopefully the person who asked that question will be coming to the second session and can hear all the details. If not, I think I've put my email address in the chat already. So if you want to email me, I can give you some more information. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kate. That's great. Again, this about it being a public health issue, I wonder if Steve Cannane wanted to perhaps provide some comments about that, of whether his experience from the UK or something like that about it being a public health issue. Are you with us still, Steve?
Yeah. So I think I mentioned Matt Hancock was, I think he was the health minister at the time he brought the gambling reforms in, and I should check that because there was a time he was the media minister as well. So I could be getting my facts wrong on that. It's worth checking that because he did move from one portfolio to the other. But to be honest, it wasn't on the agenda there at all because they don't have the problem that they have here with poker machines. It's more of an issue, I would say, with online betting, wagering. And they do have a national regulator there, unlike in Australia. I mean, if you look at the sports betting space, racing and sports betting, the main regulator is in the Northern Territory, the NT Racing Commission, and that's because about 20 sports betting agencies set up in the Northern Territory because of tax reasons. And I looked at the Racing and Betting Act, which I think was in Northern Territory, which I think was written in 1983 and doesn't have any reference to online at all. Of course, the internet really wasn't around in 1983, as we know it now. So their act is out of date, and there's a lot of criticisms of the regulator there. And there's a lot of people think that we should have a national regulator like they have in the UK. There is a fair bit of reporting on predatory practices in the sports betting wagering space in the UK. So that's probably more on the agenda there. But you've got to realise that no other country has poker machines in pubs and clubs like Australia does. No one does. So it's a very different public debate about gambling in Australia than it is in other countries.
Okay. Yep, true. Thank you. Thanks for that. Another question here we have, can any of the panelists expand on the data and practice related to young people in particular, and how this should be informing our policy and responses for young people? You want to maybe Sally, were you talking about some of the young people in your survey? I think there was some discussion around that.
That's right. I'm happy to speak with that. And I think it's a really important question. Young people are the most likely group to be gambling online, and they're less likely to be engaged in pokies, although there might be a generational shift, obviously, as the current generations become a little bit older, but they don't seem to be engaging in venue-based gambling to the same extent. There's a huge plethora of activities online, and there's a lot of entertainment options. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they're gambling less. The next generations are quite different, and so we do need different response strategies, both within treatment as well as prevention methods. We can't expect the same sort of public health campaigns to impact someone who's over the age of 50 as it will of someone who's under the age of 30. Unfortunately, young people do have somewhat of a sense of immunity and their risk taking, which is just a developmental aspect. But young people can get into quite entrenched gambling problems. And although the consequences may be less if they have fewer responsibilities or requirements, those problems become very obvious pretty early on when they do decide to potentially start a family or want to buy a house and they've got no savings. So it's really important that we do put a lot of thought and effort. And I think in New South Wales, there's a great program, which is called Odds on Youth. And the focus is on training professionals who work with young people. And this is what's really lacking, I think. A lot of the effort is put on educating the person. However, we know for every person that seeks help that they might interact with multiple professionals in their life before they seek help. They're talking to financial counsellors, to doctors, to health experts, to legal experts. And if those people start to ask about gambling, it normalises the conversation, just like any kind of conversation about do you smoke, do you drink, as part of a health checkup. And then to start to identify gambling harms. And if we try, and that's the whole point of this Gamble Aware Week, to try and get friends, family and professionals to start recognising those potential risk indicators and have those conversations as early as possible so harms don't get out of control.
Thanks a lot, Sally. That was a really detailed answer. Thank you very much for that. That was really good. I did want to give Mary Lou perhaps an opportunity to provide an answer to a question. Mary Lou, there's a question here about what policy directions do we need to take to denormalise online gambling? And I suppose I was thinking more about, in your practice of those services that are provided and how people relate to gambling. What would your answer to that question be? Are you with us, Mary Lou?
She's muted.
Mary Lou, you might be muted. Are you? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Too many buttons again. What sort of policies Well, that's a very big question. There has been so many recommendations in the past around what, how, when, and I really don't know what would be mutually acceptable by people who are saying that we all have the right to do this and that, and people who then go saying, well, there's so much damage done, we really need to do something about it. And within that group, there's a fair bit of variation between people, what they think that could be useful, how it would work. So it's a very complex question.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry.
So no, that's all right. Let's break it down. Maybe just in your practice with counselling and the services, you know, that approach to denormalising online gambling. Is there a way that you look at that when there's counselling services are being provided, or how you approach that?
Well, look, online gambling for young people is a very big thing. There's a generation now that has not known a world without internet, without understanding and feeling so comfortable with everything online. And the very big issue, as Sally pointed out, is that, you know, whilst there are rules and regulations within Australian context, the issue is really mostly to do with the offshore operators, in as much as they are unregulated. Australian authorities have no impact on their behaviour, I guess, or how they provide services in the Australian context. And look, internet is available everywhere now, more and more. It's an avalanche. Yeah. And I don't know if it can be stopped, to be honest. How to work with that, I leave that to smarter people than me. We are trying our very best to help people find alternate activities and to make them realize why is that they are also stuck on that. And I think that's probably with most every gambling addiction, and most every addiction, it's really important to find out what's underneath it all, and then go from there.
Yeah, wise words. Thank you, Mary Lou. That was great. Okay, we might move on, because we have some other speakers who are waiting patiently to talk. Kate Roberts is our next speaker. Kate is an executive officer with the Gambling Impact Society for New South Wales, and is a senior social worker with over 30 years working in health and social services in Australia and the UK. So hopefully, Kate, you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate.
Yes, and this is a shared section between myself and our chairperson, Lee, who'll be coming on in about 5 minutes, to share his journey around gambling. But just to start us off, I feel I might just read you something from a Facebook group page that I'm part of, which is there is to support people experiencing gambling problems. And I'll just share that with you. This was written anonymously in June. In some ways, coronavirus has been helpful with regard to people with gambling problems. The poker machines were turned off, casinos, pubs and clubs were closed. It made it harder to access some forms of gambling, but the horse racing didn't stop. Sports bet and online tabs were still operating. Online casinos were still available. In the last 3 months, since all the coronavirus restrictions started, I've lost my job. Our family savings, more than 20,000 in 2 weeks, to online betting, 2 brand new phones, a trailer, an iPad, and various other household items that have been sold to pay for gambling. My marriage has disintegrated, and I've lost valuable time with my children that I can't get back. There were times when I haven't been able to pay the mortgage or buy food for my children. I've missed important family events, including my 10-year wedding anniversary, which I spent alone. The police have been to my house at least 4 times, and they've filed a missing persons report. I've been depressed, anxious, and insecure, and at times suicidal. I've argued with family and friends who can't understand what is going on, or who don't want to hear about it anymore, or keep telling me to change things. The problem is, I can only change what I can control. And it's not me with the gambling problem, it's my husband. I can't control his lying, gambling, or destructive behaviour that goes along with it. And gambling destroys everything around it. It creates so much damage and destruction in its path. And most of the time, those with the issue don't even realize the damage it has done. I guess it's easier not to think about it or to just focus on how you can get more money to gamble again. If you have a gambling problem, get help. If not for you, then for those around you. And I share that really as someone who's also experienced as the partner of someone who had a gambling problem and struggled with that probably from the age of 18 to in his 50s on and off. And that's why we started the Gambling Impact Society, really, as a group of people who'd been impacted, but also health and welfare professionals like myself, in my other hat, who had an interest in this field. And we've been going now for 20 years. Set up basically to provide information into the community, to provide community education, professional training, and self-help resources for people who may be struggling with a gambling issue, either as a family member or as someone who has a gambling problem or is experiencing gambling harms themselves. And within that 20 years, we've come to realise that the importance of hearing voices of people who've actually experienced gambling harms cuts through many of the other intellectual aspects of this, which are equally important, but I guess get to people's hearts as well as their heads. And so as part of our programs, which you can look at on our website, and I'll post some links to that later, we run a program called Consumer Voices or Lived Experience programs. And we've been doing that for now 8 years, on and off with funding. Unfortunately, it's not sustainable funding and we lurch from one year to another. But basically taking the stories of lived experience into the community to try and break down some of the barriers towards understanding and increase people's appreciation of some of the complexities around gambling harms and some of the impacts of particular products in the community, and an increased understanding that this isn't just an individual problem. It affects families, it affects communities, it affects employers, it affects friends. And that, as Kate DaCosta outlined, we as a society also have some choices about how much gambling do we want in our community, how do we want to experience this going forward, and how can we get behind calls for reform. So we have also supported the setting up of the Alliance for Gambling Reform and are keen participants in that journey as well. But we're going to be joined today by Lee, who is our chairperson and, like many of us, wears a number of hats in this field. Lee has been one of our keen consumer voice speakers. We train people through a 2.5-day residential training program, and also we also engage them in further forms of training, coaching and mentoring to be able to tell their stories into the community within safe boundaries. And we basically target a lot of those community welfare services, as Sally and others were saying, who don't necessarily get very much training in their original backgrounds about gambling harms. And we partner up with the network of gambling help counselling services across the state, and we go out with them to put an interactive and interesting conversation around gambling and gambling harms. And we've been doing that now, I think, in Fairfield and Southwest Sydney. Over 800 people have received that 1-hour presentation that we've been delivering. Of course, with COVID, that meant that we also had to start doing that online, and that meant people like myself and my other project officers were involved as presenters and moderators. And we're very happy to continue to take that out to the community where we can. At the moment, we're just coming to the end of that funding round, so we're going to be looking for new funding for the future to maintain that. But
that's great. Okay, have we got Lee online? I know he was. We tried to give him a time to be here.
We were, and we noticed that unfortunately 5 minutes got moved into our session. So we.
That's all right. Is Lee with us yet?
I'm hoping Lee.
Good day, everyone.
Yes, Lee is
thanks,
there.
Lee. That's great.
Well, I'd like to now introduce Lee then as our consumer voice speaker, and he'll be talking for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open that up for about 6 minutes of questions. Thank you. Welcome, Lee.
Good day, everyone. So yes, I'm chairperson of the Gambling Impact Society of New South Wales and lived experience speaker. So I'm a person who has experienced harm from gambling products. Most of my my involvement with or my addiction surrounded poker machines. Some of my story relates to gambling on races and sports betting, but for the most part, my addiction was on poker machines. So some would say that I have a long family history of gambling. My great-grandfather was implicated in a horse racing fix in Queensland in the early 1900s. He quickly left Australia for the war effort and then returned only to be surrounded by his ghosts. My grandfather, my fondest memories are of being in front of the racing form at 10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, getting the scratchings from the race radio. And then my father. We lost I lost my mother. He lost his partner in the late 80s. And we lived in Victoria around about the start of the 90s. Poker machines started to move into society down there. And he used it as a coping mechanism for the pain and loss, and also because he had some issues surrounding a partner that he made acquaintance with who wasn't so much of a good influence on him. So my teen years were spent in the back of a beat-up old Hilux in the back of a pub car park waiting for my father to come out. And if he came out with a smile on his face, then we were off to Macca's for a nice meal. If he came out with a frown on his face, then the next day I'd be at St. Vincent's de Paul to pick up a food parcel so we could get the family through the week and carry on. Later on in life, I obviously had, being in Victoria, coming of age, I was able to avoid poker machines because they weren't quite as prevalent in Victoria as they are in New South Wales. So I would actively choose to go to venues that didn't have poker machines. But later on in my career life, I moved into the Defence Force and moved up to New South Wales, and that choice wasn't so readily available. So I'd spend some of my recreation time with my friends in venues that had poker machines, and I just learned to live with that. In 2006, where my story sort of begins with poker machines and gambling products, I had to separate geographically from my then girlfriend, who was doing a university course, needed to go back to her original university to complete the course. So she went to Melbourne and I stayed in New South Wales, and I had quite a lot of time to entertain myself. So I went to Texas Hold'em poker venues and signed in for poker, and then there's an hour registration period between when you sign in and when the game starts. So I'd have a drink or have a meal, and then inevitably started playing poker machines. I had what I call my heroin moment, because heroin users describe the first time they use the drug as being the biggest high they've ever had, and they chase that high their entire addiction. And it was a similar sort of feeling that I had with poker machines. I put in what was seemingly a small amount of money, had a large win, and had quite a euphoric sort of moment from that. And then that sort of continued or perpetuated the movement towards the machines. So I would continue to go to Texas Hold'em nights, register, and then go and play the machines. And eventually the denominations that I put in the machines would get to higher and higher until the point where I was spending more time in front of the machines instead of going and playing poker. I had a bit of a forced break, and I went to WA and did some work off of the Australian station, made a bit of money, and then came back. And during that period, I was able to get a break from poker machines and gambling, because in WA, obviously, it's there are no poker machines. But coming back to New South Wales, I moved to King's Cross. So I moved from where there was no poker machines to where there are literally thousands of poker machines in, a square block. So I moved to King's Cross, and I'd have to walk past venues on the way to work. And then conversely, on the way back from work, walk past the same venues. So I'd go home, get changed, and then go out to the clubs or go to the pubs. So one pub, I attribute my addiction to basically renovating their smoking area, their cigarette smoking area of the gaming venue, because I'd lost a considerable amount of money in that venue. After that period, I reunited with my family. They moved up here to the south coast of New South Wales, but my addiction still had a bit of a bite. I would pick up the keys and grab the car and go for the milk run, but instead of going for the milk, I'd spend probably an hour or two playing poker machines until I have what I call my Alka-Seltzer moment. I call it the Alka-Seltzer moment because my relationship, or an analogy of a relationship, is like Alka-Seltzer in a glass. When you put two tablets in the glass, they're there, solid and together. But as soon as you start to dilute that trust and that those tablets with a little bit of water and the lies of the water, the Alka-Seltzer dissolves until it's no longer perceptible as being solid. And that's my relationship. It was no longer solid. It was now disappearing before my eyes. And I had an ultimatum, a crisis moment where I was in a poker machine venue, and my wife called me to say that my children were quite sick and that I needed to get some medicine on the way home. I live in rural New South Wales, so chemists are only open to a particular time, and if you don't get to the chemist in time, that's it, you miss out. So I got a phone call at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon saying, come home, you need to get some medicine on the way home and come and help your kids. At 6 o'clock in the afternoon, I was still in front of a poker machine, and 13 past 6, my wife rang up and said, we're finished, don't bother coming home. And so we separated for a period of time, and I went down to my father's place in Victoria to try and sort out my life and figure out where I was going to go from here. I tried a number of different help organisations. I went to Gambling Anonymous. I tried self-help, seeing doctors, psychologists, etc. But my drama was that being in the Defence Force, I was scared that I would lose reputation and my ability to carry out my job with the Defence Force. I eventually bit the bullet and sought help from a psychologist who happened to know somebody who was a specialist in cognitive behavioural therapy, and I sought help from Kate and gained an avenue that worked for me in getting a hold of my addiction. Thankfully, my wife didn't leave me altogether, and we were able to reunite later in October of 2013. We've been together ever since. But that's not always the case for all people, and it generally takes a crisis moment for people to seek help, which is obviously due to the stigma that surrounds the issue, and other things like employment and people's self-ideologies or family ideologies. Family is also a big stigma to people. Erin wouldn't talk about my addiction with her family until later on because of the stigma that was surrounding her and having a husband that was obviously having a problem with addiction. Thank you for listening to my story.
Thank you so much, Lee, for sharing that. We really appreciate it, and we know it's very, I'm sure, very hard to tell that story, but it's really important to hear them. And for everyone that's on this webinar today, I'm sure I speak on behalf of them. Thank you very much for doing that. So we've got a few minutes left. I don't know if anyone, very kindly, Lee and Kate have agreed to take a couple of questions or a question. If anyone has anything they want to ask, please put it in the Q&A box. And as we said before, there are so many links that we've provided here in the chat box. We'll be sending those out to you as part of the session today, the recording, and you'll be able to access that on YouTube and get that information. So I don't know if people have any questions. Maybe not. Maybe we're all heading towards, it's been a long session, we're all heading towards lunchtime, and that's probably highly important. So thanks very much for joining us. Thanks to all our speakers. We really appreciate that. We'll be sending out a survey, an evaluation survey, also in the chat that you can access. We'd love you to fill it in. It's really important to know what sort of things we should be presenting to you, how you found this webinar today. Session 2 starts at 12:45, so you've got time for lunch, have a walk around. Session 2 is really focusing on projects that are happening now in the area and projects, new projects that have been recently funded. So I think you'll find that really interesting, and it will link up with this morning's session. So that's really important. I'd like to thank all the team from Fairfield City Council, for Martha, Chris, Peter and Susan, Catherine. You've all been terrific. We've had it's a lot of effort to put this together. So I hope you found this really some new information, some supportive information from this morning's session. And thanks for joining us. Take care and keep COVID safe. Thanks a lot.